Okay, everybody. Dominique's going to give us a welcome. I think we should all take a deep breath together.
That was actually what I was going to start with.
Oh, good.
Hey, everybody. It's been a few, so I think we should just sort of start with a nice deep breath. So if everybody could just close their eyes for 2 seconds. You know, I want to just thank you all for being here. Take some deep breaths in and out. I hope you got some food ahead of time because 8, 9 o'clock is really long. And again, just breathe in, take one deep breath, and exhale. Shake your shoulders out when everybody's probably sitting down stationary. So if you need to stand up, if you need to show up on your couch, however you need to show up, we're here for you to do that. So just want to thank you all again for taking the time. And today we're going to be really diving in. So the definition of ready sort of for this meeting today is that we're going to have had everybody had a chance to read the discussion slides. So beforehand, just a show of hands for everybody, who did read the discussion slides? All right, getting a good amount. All right, cool. Thank you for doing that ahead of time. So you guys have read the discussion the discussion guide slides and made your notes on what additions and subtractions you have for recommendations, because we're going to be really discussing them today. The definition of done for us is that we're going to, as a team, agree to a list of short-term and long-term recommendations specific to what we were sort of talking about at the last meeting around sexual assault calls related to policy writing, training, data, and the budget here specifically in Red Wing. And then we're going to spend the majority of the time reviewing the past work and discussing potential recommendations. So we're walking through these together. It's going to be a really cool exercise we're going to do as best as we can, given that we're on the screens. And Michelle is going to sort of kick us off to do that. And again, I just want to thank you all for being here. I know next week is Thanksgiving, and maybe many of you will be doing that virtually. So stay safe and let's get started.
All right, good deal. So Melissa, can you show us our, welcome everybody. I didn't get to say hi to everybody. Steve, Corey H, Sam, and Alexis. Hey, it's good to have you. Let's just run through very quickly some of these beginning slides. You're probably tired of going through these slides, but some of this is also to let the public know, where we're at, what we're doing, and just to kind of give anybody who dips into this process at any point, they can kind of see where you all are at. So thanks, Melissa. Can you go to the first one, the next slide here? So this is really a chart that we will continue to have each time, where we started and where we are now. And we don't spend a lot of time on this. You can look through it unless you have some major issues with it. But the top part is always what we planned. And in yellow is what we did. And then we're in the big highlighted box now. That's where we are now, meeting number 5, November 18th. And we'll continue to march along each time and just keep everybody updated. If there's someone from the public who steps in at any time, they will know exactly where you guys have been and where you're headed. So that's what that is. We can go to the next slide, Melissa. So just a brief look, when we all dove into that call for service of sexual assault, there was one thing that we ended up, all of us, sort of talking about, and that was kind of interesting. So this sort of lays out what we sort of heard you all talking about, which is that gray box says what the topic or the call for service. Whatever it is, that is the activity that happened. And from that are all these different foundations that show what happens in Red Wing. So the policy or the practice, a practice is just how we act, that the policies tell the staff what to do. In this case, it's the police department. In other months, it will be another department, but the policy tells staff what to do. The training tells them how to do it. The data says how much and how well we're doing it. And the budget shows how the city and our community really prioritizes it. So those are just the 4 big buckets that are the foundations of how each department works. And so this sort of just, again, it's a different, yep, you can go to the 3rd slide, Melissa. This next slide really goes through, and it just shows how everything contributes. And again, you know, policy, training, and budget all contribute to how well we do something. And then that data goes back and forth. How much are we doing? How well are we doing it? Is anybody better off because of what we did? And the way that we know that is that we get enough data and we collect it using best practices and we communicate it well. Otherwise, we don't know what we're doing well and what we need help with. And then just off to the left, that gray box really talks about the culture of a department and the mental health resources. And if you're a police officer or you're a staff member in another department, and I would say this works for all of us wherever we work, the culture of whether it's our family, our school, and wherever we are, and then the mental health resources that we have, those also contribute to how well we do what we do. So this is just sort of an outline to remind us of why we're looking at things. Based on the policy, training, budget, and data, are there any big questions on that? Otherwise, we'll continue. But say it verbally because I can't see you all. Okay, so next slide, Melissa. Okay, so based on the last couple meetings, we dug into that sexual assault calls. It seemed like these were questions that we might want to dig into, and it's really how do we and should we write policy as a general department and as a city of Portland? How do we and should we train our staff? How do we and should we collect and report the data? And how do we and should we prioritize and budget? And those 4 things, again, contribute to how well we do our job in whatever we're doing. So those are 4 big buckets. Okay, next slide. Dominique will kind of go through the next couple slides.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I felt like it's some static. So there's no echo, right? I feel like there's an echo, but I just want to be sure. No echo?
I think it just stopped.
Oh, okay, perfect. So the sexual assault, I want to talk about why this was the first thing the advisory team delved into. So when we first sort of did the CPE overall roadmap, we looked at a bunch of calls for service. And then the goal was that we would narrow down the topic to a few of the different buckets that folks were really interested in to sort of take that to the next level and get these policy recommendations, learn more about the data, learn more about the training to make adequate recommendations. We were super lucky to have Sarah on our team. I'm not going to read you the actual bullet point, but listen, you had some best practices to talk to us about, and we appreciate you for sort of leading us through that conversation. When we reviewed the initial data, we realized that, you know, this was a place where we could lean in to create those recommendations that we hope to see. And I think that that was really powerful. And I'm super glad that we were able to sort of move that conversation forward. And I just want to note that while sexual assault policy may not initially be viewed as a racially inequitable system, it does affect how people at their most vulnerable point are treated by police. So I do want to make that acknowledgement. I know we sort of had some discussion around that the last time. And so we always want to remember that when a policy does not work for some, Black and Brown people are more likely to be disproportionately and negatively affected by this. So I do want to make that acknowledgement. Next slide. And so this is really, as we always go through it every time, it'll be on the website. This is just the advisory team's process of the 4 steps and how we're going to assume good intent by all of those. Step 1 is learning about the specific systems and work within the department, which would be the police department at this time in Red Wing. learning and sharing how different communities experience those systems. So really looking at the policies, data, training, and budgets for how communities are experiencing these, learning about options and best practices and evidence-based approaches, which is sort of what we did when Sarah sort of gave us the insight into how calls for service work for sexual assault with Hope Coalition, and the chief and Corey sort of gave us some insight into how it currently functions in the department. And the goal for step 4 is to recommend those changes to the city council, and then the city council will make those decisions. So that's where we are right now. And we want to make sure that we are sort of looping in steps 1 through 3 as we go about step 4. Next slide. I'm not going to bore you with this slide, but this is all the work that we've done so far. This is just so that the public has knowledge of what we have done so far. This is for you all to really congratulate yourselves on the work that we are doing so far, because I know it seems like there is not much traction in that. You know, we want to be able to move work forward, and we are, and we will, and we do. So I just want to acknowledge that. Next slide. Okay. So Michelle is going to jump in here because we're going to start doing some of the work.
Okay. So what we're going to do is, and if you guys have kind of looked through it, you'll see that we have these 4 areas of policy, training, data, and budget. And through all of those conversations that you talked about, there were actual recommendation ideas that came through in all of those. So what we're going to ask you to do, and I will tell you that if we were all in a room together, we would have all of these recommendations written up on big, huge white sheets of paper. And if any of you have been to some of our meetings in Red Wing, you might recall these. So we would have recommendations written all across all the walls of the room. And then you all would get some sticky notes, and you would get some stickers, and you'd be able to walking around the room by yourself, silently looking at all the recommendations, taking a pen and writing things down where you wanted to, putting green and red stickers where you wanted a recommendation and where you didn't. But until hopefully summer, when we can get together in a room, we're going to have to do it a little differently. So it's going to be a little bit of a speed round, but know that where you have questions and where you have maybe disagreements, where you want to dig into some stuff, we will walk through all the recommendations, and then there will be plenty of time to come back and have conversation. So what I'm hoping you all can do, tell me if you all have 3 sheets of paper. So I sent an email, but it wasn't until later today. So I'm not sure if everyone got that. But if you have 3 sheets of paper, I want you to write a big yes on one. It can be a half sheet of paper, but we want to have you have a yes, a no, and an unsure. Okay. If this doesn't work, we will do thumbs up, thumbs down, and thumbs sideways. But we're going to try to do it this way and see if this works. So 3 sheets of paper, a big yes, a big no on one, and an unsure. And what Dominique and I are going to do, and you're going to hear our voices for a little bit longer, and then we'll get into discussion where we'll hear your voices finally. We're going to read through these recommendations. We will also get to your questions and everything like that. But let's say that we get to something and all of you, or most of you, 9 out of 11, say yes. Then you will at least be able to see where there was some agreement in the room and where there is not. So does any questions about that? And because we're looking at the screen, you might have to verbally say, hey, Michelle, I don't get what you're saying. So I'm going to wait. I'm going to pause here, and you ask me if you know what I'm what I'm asking you to do. Okay, we're going to go for it and see. Okay, is that you, Sam?
Yes. I understand what you're asking of us. I just have a question before we get into it, because I feel like it feels like kind of silencing us, but you're.
Yep. Yes.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
For sure, for sure. So this is going to be a little bit rapid fire because then we'll have a long time to discuss. Okay. So this should take just a few, 10 minutes maybe. And then we'll see how long this takes. It shouldn't take too long. What we're going to go through for each of these topics is a little section on policy writing, little section on training, little section on data, and a section on budget. And in each of those, we're going to have a quick slide that just says what it seemed from rewatching the videos and taking the summary notes, what we understood that the team said, and then what's been learned since then, and then some possible short and long-term recommendations. There should and will be a lot of discussion around all this. So, Melissa, do you want to get to the next slide? Okay. So the things that it seemed like the group was talking about was they wanted, and I won't read everything here, but to find a way to connect police with an advocate sooner and more often, to make sure that people know about advocates. So whether or not they go to the police, they at least know that there's help. To try to get more resources and advocates for Spanish-speaking residents, some possibility that you've got options has promised, but we probably need to know more, and to look into the process for those who are wrongly accused. We're going to try this with policy, and you guys can let me know if this works for you. So let's just go through 3 slides. Next one, Melissa. Okay, so Hope Coalition got together with the police representatives and had a meeting and tried to find out where there could be change, because what this advisory team proposes has to be something that works. We did find out, and this can be more discussion, Red Wing cannot change dispatch policy right now. It's in county control. That may be something later. Sarah and Roger could possibly find out if this is a change to make in the future and could report back to us. But we did find out that there are some short-term and long-term changes that could be recommended by the team. So let's get into that. So I'll read through the actual recommendations. Again, these do not have to be the recommendations that you make, but we want to see at least where people have some support around. And these won't be the exact wording. So part of it is that you could edit portions of the current sexual assault policy now, so the victims could be connected with an advocate right away. We'll come back, but Melissa, can you flip to the next slide so we can actually see that language? So the police got together. They wanted to bring you some possible options. And so what this says is, instead of saying officers are encouraged, they will prioritize and make every effort to connect the victim with an advocate. And we can get into more discussion on this. The idea was that sometimes a detective will give someone a card. And if it's 3 a.m, a victim may feel like, I don't want to bother an advocate. But if the detective actually calls that person and there is a physical person on the other side of the phone line, and they say, I have an advocate here who would like to talk to you. Would you be interested in talking with this person right now, just so she could introduce herself? And that might be a way where an advocate would actually, or a victim or a person who's experienced this might say, sure. They're not bound to doing it. And if they choose to say no, then the detective can give that person a card and make a connection that way. But this was one part of a conversation that said, how could we make sure that advocates are connected sooner and more often? I think because this is the only written policy piece, the rest are broader recommendations, we might want to get some thoughts about what people feel about this. I think before anyone says that they would support something like this or not, Does everyone even understand what this is saying?
This slide covering just policy changes, or can anything else be added as far as adding policy?
Things can definitely be added.
Yeah. So Samantha, are you asking like how information would be collected, which would fall under like data, how they like the sort of the more of the like process logistics pieces of how this would be implemented?
Training would fall under training. So
Yeah.
that's to come.
But like as a given policy right now, before you add all of the things, like let's say we want the data for these calls to be collected this way. When it says officers will prioritize and make every effort, like what does that look like in practice? Like what are we going to write to say an officer does this, 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 and this? And then for budget, like how many officers will be assigned to do this actual work? So those pieces, yes, you can add and change those. But what we're trying to get a sense of is like, what is this overall sort of structure right now feeling okay for people? Temperature check, yes or no, you know?
And I think that's why it's helpful to look at the slides ahead so you can kind of see all the different things. But yeah. Okay.
Question wrong, but I just feel like there was a topic discussed that
Well, we could go through the other slides because there are about 20 more. Yeah. But you could say, Sam, like, hey, I thought this was discussed, and then we can write that down and discuss that at the, after we go through these. What would you say?
I think she got cut off.
There we go. I just think that the adding a policy or change, whatever you want to call it, for the wrongly accused should be at least discussed more.
Yeah, so that can be discussed more. It's just this is for this particular policy right here is one policy change for when we're just trying to connect an advocate to, just trying to connect those dots.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Nope. That's a good question. Melissa, do you want to go back a little bit to the other slide? To the one previous? Thanks. So what we're going to do is this is simply a policy change to make sure, hopefully, that someone who's experienced sexual assault would be connected with an advocate sooner and more often. We're going to try this and see if we can. I'm going to change my screen so that I can see all of you, and I'm going to have you hold up your sheets of paper. And like I said, normally we don't do it this way. So we are all learning. I'm learning how to do these meetings in a virtual world. Normally we would do it much differently. What I'm going to ask you all, there you are. I see you on my screen now. I'm going to ask you all is this something that you think is worth asking to be changed? And you can put up unsure if you think, I don't know. That's totally fine. But if you can put yes, no, yeah, okay, Liz she's got the point there. If you can just put up then, oh gosh, this is okay. Okay.
Wait, Liz, is yours typed? Your yes? That's so funny.
That's awesome. Okay. Oh, Thomas, I don't see you. Oh, your thumbs up. And Michael, can you give me a thumbs up, down, or sideways? I see everybody else. Okay, everybody is Steve, did you give me a yes? Okay, so I've got everybody yeses except Doug and Sarah are unsure. And Michael.
Alexis too. Alexis as well.
Okay.
Michael, Alexis, Doug, and Sarah are unsure.
Okay,
do we have any no's?
No no's. Okay, so that is one where we're noting it. We're going to keep going through. We're going to come back. Okay. So let's go through this. Possible long-term recommendations. Yes, no, or unsure. That you would like to prioritize, or the police department to prioritize hiring a bilingual officer and or detective. Yes, no, or unsure. Okay. Got it. Okay.
Corey's unsure.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to call you out and like single you out. I'm just making sure I'm like counting all the yeses. Okay. So we have just one unsure. Steve, what was yours? And Thomas?
Yes. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Perfect.
Okay. And it's kind of good for this group to know that when we say consensus, because this is good for me to remember, I sometimes forget. You know, I like everybody to get along and everybody to agree, but consensus really is the majority. So it doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about it, but if there are things that are a high majority, that says a lot. We don't need everybody to agree 100% of the time on every single thing, because that's probably not going to happen. Okay, so the next one is, since I can't see my, okay. The next one is that the Red Wing Police Department should work closely with Hope Coalition to review the You Have Options program. You could also recommend that one of you sits in on that and that you go through the You Have Options program, and you'd like them to bring back a report to this team in the spring so that you have more information on that program and that the Red Wing Police Department has more time to figure out how that could actually fit into the system, because we do not want any team members to go before the council without knowing exactly how that could fit into something, you know? So is that something that you would like? Hope to work with the police department and look into that program in more detail. Okay. All right. Okay.
One looks like one no.
Yep. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And the final one, at least for now, and then you can all, you know, we'll get to a point where you can add, is that the staff would bring back to the advisory team, and staff can be myself, it can be part of the police department, but to bring back a report on how we actually do policy writing. How do we write policy in Red Wing? And what options are available for a more community-driven police writing way that we do it, and what a permanent resident advisory board would look like in continuing to review policy after these 18 months. So that's a longer term, but it's having you all say, we would like to have some information brought forward and do a deeper dive into how we write policy. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Okay. All right.
A no, three unsures. Cholaway, one no. Actually, four unsures.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Four, one no, and then Cholaway. Okay, she has yes. Samantha,
Okay.
what's yours? Unsure.
Okay.
So 5 unsures.
Okay. Okay, good. So that is what we'd like to do. What you just did took about 5 minutes. That was for policy. We'd like to do that for training. We'd like to do, now this is not, this is just from the things that you've said over the last couple months. And we'll go through training. Data and budget are pretty short, and then we'll come back and see what all you want to add that wasn't there. And when we have a lot of unsures, are there things that you would like to talk about more? So are you game to go through each of these? Otherwise, we may not get to the end. So if we just keep rapid fire, is that okay with you? Give me a, oh, okay, yay.
Yes.
Okay. I like these signs. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go to training, okay? Some of this is specific to sexual assault. Some of it is broader. And Melissa, are you kind of switching the, yeah, okay, I'm sorry, there we go.
One more, I think go up a little teeny bit more.
Yep, there we go, to training.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. Dominique, do you want to do this, or do you want me
Yeah,
to keep
so
it?
I can jump in. Yeah, so for training, and I'm looking on my phone because I want to see your faces on the screen. So when we talked about training, we talked a lot about FETI, which was the forensics experimental trauma interview, as we're thinking about the interview process for a sexual assault, when we're sort of having folks who are experiencing trauma be able to be trained to be able to have that work. And so Sarah shared some success stories from other communities using that approach and the training that it would require from the officers and detectives when they work with folks who would be able to handle those calls for service. And then the other piece that we sort of learned was that it should be a priority that officers and detectives have the proper training and interviewing the sort of survivors of sexual assault as we're having the interactions with them. And those were the things that we talked about or sort of gathered at the last meeting. But the information that we've learned since the last meeting, and I think you can go to the next slide if people are looking at that, learn instead, information, okay. So we're aligned here. So what we learned was that the Red Wing Police Department currently uses Cornerstone training for all of that. And what needs to happen is that there needs to be more research around the differences between the FETI training and the Cornerstone training for which is a best trauma-based interviewing skills and guidance practice. Money, so this is important. Funding is available through Goodhue County SMART Team before December 31st. So this could go to putting one officer or detective through the FETI training. So even if we decide FETI, there's a possibility that they could be trained by December 31st if we put that forward. And the officer could then report to this group about the experiences to then say, FETI training is a go, we like it, or let's look at Cornerstone and figure out what's the best way to go forward. Also, Sarah and Detective Keegan agreed at a meeting that the Red Wing Police Department and Hope should put together an outline of how detectives and advocates can get to know each other so that they're going to work together better. So a lot of the conversation that you all were having was about the disconnect between the two processes. And so that's what we learned at the conversation with Sarah and Detective Keegan. And also, Sarah knows a champion with FETI training who could talk about these policies with us. So that is also an option. And then mandatory and optional training has been provided by the Red Wing Police Department. So that's going to be the next slide. And so and this is still tied into information for training that we learned at the last meeting. So I'm trying to rush through this so we can get through the exercise and get to discussion, but I don't want to miss anything. So if you look at this chart, you probably have seen it before. Information that we learned about police training in all areas is that the state of Minnesota pays for all of Red Wing's training. So if you look at this chart, which you probably can't see in the corner, the slightly higher cost under state aid covers the cost for training plus food plus travel, and training costs are not paid for by taxpayers. So the 2020 cost for training in all areas is $23,522 and amounts to about 0.47% of the total policing budget. So I want you to hold that because I know that's going to come into play when we have the discussion around the numbers. They're not, they're looking a little shaky here. So also want to say that required by Minnesota state statutes, that's the next slide, and the Peace Officer Standards and Training Post Board, every officer is required to have 48 hours of continuing education every 3 years in order to renew their licenses. And this includes the mandatory 12 hours per year. And so all this information is here. I'm trying to move through so we can actually get to discussion. But I do want to say talk about the mandatory trainings right now related to use of force and vehicle pursuit. These are other mandatory trainings. And then these are mandatory trainings being added as of January 2021 by the state legislature. So if you want to do a deeper dive into that, that's there. So now I want us to go actually into the exercise where we talk about possible short-term recommendations and possible long-term recommendations as we're considering training when it comes to sexual assault. And remember, this is the rapid fire because Michelle's keeping score so then we can go into the actual discussion piece of it. All right, so possible short-term recommendations would be that the Goodhue County SMART funding should go towards sending one Red Wing police detective to the virtual FEDI training. Wish it could be in person. The detective would then provide a summary report to the police chief, which Chief Pullman, and share findings with the advisory team. So is this, as I just read that, let's put up your cards, a yes, a no, or unsure. Looks like I'm seeing a lot of unshores. General consensus is unsure, and then a no. Cholaway, I can't see your, yeah, no. Thumbs down, thumbs up. Unsure. I saw this like, yeah, unsure. Okay. So it looks like general consensus is unsure. All right. So I got to open up for the next recommendation. Sorry. Can you move the slides up to the based on team input recommendations to consider sheet? I'm so sorry. All right. So the next piece would be that Hope Coalition and the Red Wing Police Department detectives should outline a set of meetings to build relationships that will be helpful when they work together on cases. Yes, no, unsure. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, yes, yes. Michael, Cholaway. I can't see you. Sorry. I think it's a yes.
Cholaway's the only one we can't see. Cholaway, can you put your paper up?
Yes, that's what it looks like. Yes.
Thanks.
All right, cool. All right. So the next one would be under the long-term, possible long-term. Again, this is all flexible and we're just getting temperature checks. So when we're thinking about training, as we're thinking about recommendations for sexual assault, more research needs to be done on the FEDI training and report back if this would be a good choice for Red Wing. And the Red Wing Police Department will work with Hope Coalition to provide a report on FEDI. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, looks like yes, yes. Okay, all right. So then the last one would be staff should bring advisory team a report into how trainings are decided upon and what the main barriers are for more training. So that's thinking about officer time, access to trainings, who's paying for the trainings, so that police interactions with people who have suffered trauma are as good as possible. So really this is about having research that is led by the advisory team so that we can report on equitable systems for everyone when it comes to sexual assault trainings. So it's yes, no's, I see yeses. Yes, yes. Unsure, unsure, unsure. Samantha, was yours unsure? Yeah, unsure. Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna stop there because I think that was a lot. So Michelle, I'm thinking that now we may want to pause and sort of start working through, or do we want to just rapid fire through?
Well, first, I think I got the last unsures of the last one. And I mean, we know that that'll be discussion, but can you just raise your hand if you were unsure about the report into trainings, the one that we just had? Okay. Steve, Alexa, Sam, Doug. Okay. Sam. Okay. Steve, Sam, Alexis, Doug. Okay. Thank you. You know what? So it is 6:45. What I want to say is the recommendations on data and budget are pretty short. They're like 2 each. So
let's just run through them really quickly.
Yep,
yeah, let's run through them really quick so that we can get to discussion.
Yep.
All right,
so I'll run through that. Or do you want me to run through that, Dominique?
Yeah, run through the data. Yeah, and then everybody has sort of read these, and if you need to go more in depth, it's going to be on the website and available for you to read. So we don't want to hold you up, so you can get to discussion.
Yep. So I'm just going to read the recommendations. Melissa, if you want to go, I think it's 2 slides down. The possible longer term. Yep. When you get to the orange type. Yep. There we go. Possible longer term recommendations. You guys can put up your sheets. one recommendation is to learn more about best practices on how and when we say best practices, it's basically what people around the country are doing that have the best, that have the most success. So learn more from some of those success stories on how police departments collect and report data to their community. What are people reporting would be the best way to do that? Who is interested in learning more about that? Okay.
And also how you report, what's being collected, how is it being collected, and who says what should be collected.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Can you, Michael, thumbs up or down? I don't see you. I can't see very much. Oh, you don't know. Okay. 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 And then the second one, so that was pretty much almost from what I could tell, pretty unanimous. Yep. Thank you, Thomas. The second one and last one here is the Red Wing Police Department would work with staff and the advisory team to review best practices and then figure out ways that the Red Wing Police Department could do this. So it's basically saying, can we come back to you in the spring to make further recommendations on data? Now that means that you all can have a say in reporting that or in researching that, but it's basically saying we're not going to get all the answers right now. Do you want, it's kind of saying, it's kind of saying the same thing actually. It's to review best practices and then provide actual suggestions that Red Wing could do. Because what we don't want is to provide recommendations where people say we can't do that. So it's sort of putting that through the filter of, okay, we have some people who are saying yes, others who maybe are saying, isn't that the same thing we just said? Okay, thank you. Okay, so you want to dig into data more. Okay, let's just quickly then go through. We've got two more on budget, okay? Do you want to read this?
All right. Yeah, so I can do those real quick. So possible short-term recommendations, using funds from the SMART team to send one officer and potentially using city funds to pay for an additional officer to attend the FETI training so that people can get the training and then come back and tell us. This is tied to budget because remember that if the budget is covering these amount of things, we have to put the recommendations in to say we want this officer and this officer to go to do the FETI trainings, and not specific officers. We can decide that as well. But is this something that you all want to say yes on, no on, or you're unsure? That we would decide potentially to send one officer and use city funds for an additional officer. So that'd be two officers that we would need to think about how the budget works for that. Okay, looks like
we're kind of so. Okay.
Okay. It's like unsure. I think people may want
unsure
more into this budget piece. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
And then the last one is that everybody wants to know more about the department's budget and if funding can be rearranged or reallocated to provide dollars for more policy writing, training, and data collection. And the advisory team is going to dig deep into those budgets to figure out how to sort of rearrange the budget, the police department budget.
Are you interested in looking into the budget over the next few months? Okay. Okay. All right.
Unsure. Good. Yeah. Okay.
Mostly yeses.
All right.
Okay.
Yes.
So we can go back now because there were some very clear yeses, which
can we take the screen down now and just go back to us looking at each? I mean, maybe you guys don't want to see each other's faces, but I think it would be more helpful for the discussion. So yes, I think we want to now go back to Michelle. Do you want to take us through sort of what the scores were, and then we can sort of start the discussion? And I know Samantha wanted to really like dig into some of the implementation policy pieces of it. So Samantha, once Michelle sort of gives out the run through, if you wanted to chime in, like go forth.
So just real quickly, the ones that you all seem to agree with pretty much was prioritizing a bilingual officer or detective. That was all yeses except one. And to look more into the You Have Options program that is specific to sexual assault. And that was all yeses except one. So those are two things that we can that seemed pretty clear. The other ones were having the detectives and the advocates work together to build relationships. That was all yeses. And then looking more into the FEDI interviewing process for people who have undergone trauma, and to see how that is better or different than the corner house. I wrote that wrong. It's corner house training, not cornerstone. That was my mistake. The corner house is what we currently do at the police department. That's the training that they use. So building the relationships, looking into the FEDI research, looking into the You Have Options, and prioritizing a bilingual officer. Those were 4 things. In addition, looking into data and looking into budget. So those were 6 recommendations that you all just did. So I'm just going to give a little clap to y'all right there. There were some things that were a lot of unsures. And if we want to start at the top, one was the policy. I guess we can go through those. And I'll be quiet. One was the actual policy that was written to connect advocates to people who've experienced sexual assault. It was the actual language. There were 4 out of the 11 of you that were unsure about that. And the other thing on policy writing, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We had unsures or no's in terms of looking at how we write policy. And I think that will warrant some discussion. And then Sam about falsely accused. And one question that I have for Sam when we get to that is, can you clarify, do you want a discussion around policy as a whole on those who are falsely accused, or specific to sexual assault? So you can think about that and we can talk about that. But I'll hand it over to Dominique to kind of get us through some of these discussions that you can all have to decide what you're going to do.
All right. So Michelle, I think you should queue up the first unsure, and then we sort of work through why people were unsure. I mean, you have a right to be unsure, but then what is the middle ground, and how do we move that conversation forward?
So can we talk first about the one that had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you? So a majority of you said you seemed like you were unsure about, I might be saying this wrong, about learning more about how we write policy. Is that the case? Because we have, here was the actual thing. Staff would bring back to the advisory team a short report on how we actually write policy at the police department, what options are available for different ways of writing policy, and possibly what a permanent resident advisory board would look like. Those are kind of 3 big things pushed together, but really it's about, are you interested in learning more about how we write policy and different options for that? Or it's like, why would we even think about that?
Why'd you pick unsure? Doug?
So I picked unsure. A couple things I had with the paragraph that you described with the permanent resident advisory board. I don't know if that's something that's necessary. So why not take time looking into that? And as far as writing policy in general, for the police department, I have a little bit of hesitation with that because I don't do that job. I don't pretend to know the ins and outs of that job. And I wonder from the civilian side of things, it may actually learn more about it, but actually writing the policy, I think you're going to need a lot of help to write that in a way that's fair for and just for everybody involved, including minorities, including police officers, so that we don't inadvertently cause problems down the line. And what I mean by that is, yes, I guess sexual assault policy in particular is not so much a problem with that, but some other ones, perhaps we change it with the intent that it's going to do A, and it does do that, but it also puts them in a position that there's more risk or more doubt or things are less clear. And then you get B and C following from that. And perhaps that's circumnavigated if you have someone who's more familiar or more information from the policing side of things of where that could go wrong. because I think a lot of things will seem obvious to us as a civilian until you're there, in doing that job, and then you learn things that maybe you didn't know about it that go through their mind that make that particular policy change difficult or not useful, if that makes sense.
No, that does. Thank you. Anybody who chose yes or unsure or no, do you want to give sort of some context there? Liz?
The reason I chose yes is I have written a ton of policy in my past, and I just did for the shelter and stuff. And I appreciate another set of eyes or several sets of eyes looking at it to get a view that I'm not getting, because I'm very focused on what I want the policy to be or control or speak to. And so to get other views on what I've missed, how it's would be miscommunicated, those type of things. What I like about the idea of the permanent resident advisory board is I think that could be a broad area of people representing that, the people who work in it, the people who maybe feel unrepresented in it, because I wouldn't want our 18 months together to be like a one-shot deal. And then as we progress as a community, there's not an input, a way to keep making sure the policies are in line with what we have created. And we're just a starting point. And if we're going to be successful as a community, we need to be able to carry these policies and future policies forward in the same manner. So that's why I voted, that I would like to see that, so that we are opening it up. Of course, we want those that have to implement the policy to be able to implement it in a way that they're successful. But I don't believe that we always see things from other people's views when it's just the people who are on the front line or the first in the line writing it and those type of things.
Okay, so we had a yes, we had a unsure. Doug, yours is unsure, right? Okay, so we had an unsure, we had a yes, and Choloway, did you say no, or are you unsure? Yes.
I said yes.
Okay.
I think if we're gonna dive into looking at these policies and maybe edit or add, I think we should have a little knowledge about how they are written and how they're decided. So I think I would like to have a little bit more knowledge about that.
Anyone who said no?
And to be clear, I think that is kind of what that recommendation was, what Choloway just said, was mostly to learn more, not necessarily to change anything right now. But
Okay, so one of the things I want to say when it comes to policy is that the chief has sort of flagged for us, and I think I mentioned it a few times before we move on to the other thing, is that policy is sort of written. When I work with communities, they're sort of perplexed at how policy is sort of written. I've worked with some departments where the policy is written in-house, so they hire someone works at CPE on my team, was a former policy writer for the department in a particular city that was sort of your size in capacity. And then one of the sort of conversations at large is around Lexipol. Lexipol is someone who sort of does the standards around many different localities. It's sort of a general catch-all policy piece. And then what other departments have done is like a combination of both of those, so like thinking about if we want to write policies that are equitable and sort of really responsive to the needs of our community, Lexipol may cover sort of the state standards and the local standards overall, but it could be missing something. It could need to have something added. And so what people do is have a policy person or community-centered policy person or a team to come and say, okay, this needs to be addressed, add this, move this, think about this, and they do that collectively. So it's like a hybrid of the two. And so I just want to get a sense of, I know many of you sort of talked about the lack of sort of racial justice lens that policies hold when it comes to departments. And what would be your ideal take, or sort of if you're thinking, let's put it in the context of sexual assault. If sexual assault was a place where we would be writing policy about it, what would be your ideal? Is that it would just be currently what it is, or it would be policies that Lexipol with state mandates would cover, or would it be we hire someone in-house in Red Wing's department with the budget to write these policies for Red Wing specifically? Or is it a combination of what's already there and we have a team sort of a racial justice make these more equitable? That was a mouthful, but I just want to give you sort of the different versions of what that could or could not be. Sarah?
I just have a question, and I honestly don't know if you can answer it, but I think it was the first time that we met, you had said focusing on getting our power back and writing policies to address the issues that we have. And my kind of concern is if we write policies that are equitable, how do we address the personality of an officer could come in with completely empathetic and soft and handling trauma appropriately in one situation, and then meet someone else in a very similar situation that maybe they don't have the same empathy for and follow the policy, but their personality and their tact is not there. And so how do you write to that? And, you know, some of us met and we talked about different situations that people have had, and it made me this
Think back to that.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that then ties into training and recruitment. So like if you are writing policies around training and recruitment, these are the type of people. So one of the communities that I've worked in, their sort of catch-all was like, we want people who have a college education at this level, who live in this district. They need to be a resident of the city that they're in. They need to like specific qualifications. So that ties into policy because it has to sort of be mandated to make sure like, yes, we are shoring up our training. Everybody's going to be equitable across the board, but it's sort of a catch-all for those folks that don't, or that lack that emotional, social supports that could happen. So when people say implicit bias training, that's great as a catch-all, but what does that training mean in the local context? So you could say we want implicit bias training for all the officers, but then you could then decide like, here are the recommendations for a great implicit bias training program that we want. We want the officers to do this, 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 and this. And then the chief being here in this group could say, well, I want to point to you to this policy because that policy isn't necessarily aligned with how it goes. Happy to sort of talk to you about how we could navigate that, how we could collaborate, but he's giving you the insight as to how the policies currently stand. And you could say, we want implicit bias training and everybody has to be certified every 6 months doing these things. And this is how it's going to be monitored and evaluated. And so if we monitor and evaluate it, we're going to have this permanent resident board be the people who actually monitor and evaluate because they meet these criteria and they can sort of report back and hold people accountable. A lot of people are also looking into like these permanent resident boards or these community-centered civilian oversight boards because they're looking for sort of what you're talking about. What is the stopgap between we sharp our training, but we also have to be in community to think about like, if all of those things go right, people are still dying. So what is the disconnect and how do we sort of make a stopgap for that? I hope that was helpful. Yes, no, Liz, let Sarah before I pick up Liz.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Liz. Wait, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I agree totally that it's in the training because I don't think you can write policy for personality, but the training that we have, I know even just available free in this community would help to get the basis for why maybe people are acting or doing what they are doing at the time with the trauma that they've experienced. I know like the, like ACEs, I'm certified in that. The Goodhue County Family Collaborative, we've now put together kind of our own model of ACEs just specifically for Goodhue County. That's a free training. Those type of things I think would kind of help with the whole personality of different situations, having everyone just have a real solid trauma training and understanding. And as far as like who we pay or that type of thing, I think there's a lot of really good experienced people in Red Wing that could write this. And then if we have to use funds for it, maybe, send that outhouse a little, just to, I shouldn't say outhouse, but send that out to be, just make sure that it fits within all the requirements of the police force, so that we're not asking them to do something they can't or impossible for them to do. I know the school right now they are looking at, there's nothing probably more institutional in our community than the school system. And the policies and procedures there, that's hundreds of years old of policies and procedures that they follow. And they have started 2 new groups. They are saying that, yes, we are, our curriculum is very white view based. And I'm now serving on, I don't have an education background, but been asked to serve on that group to say, let's make our curriculum more diverse. And there's another one looking at how racism affects our students and that type of thing. So those type of movements are starting in Red Wing in other areas too. So this would go very much hand in hand with like what the school is now saying, we need to make some significant changes because what we've been doing all this time isn't working.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. So I want to make it sort of practical. So Michelle, out of the recommendations that we sort of like flew by and were like sort of consensus agreement for yes, one of them that came up was about having the advocates work with, can you read that one? Because I want to be able to give you some practical context so then you can think about how you move this forward in terms of like decision makings or moving this piece of it forward, because I know this was a chunk of what we wanted to do in terms of sexual assault. So what was that sort of consensus yes one for having the advocate, Michelle?
Yeah, so are you talking about that they would come up with an outline for how the advocates from Hope and the detectives would work together to build relationships? So that is a yes. Is that the one that you mean?
Yes, but I'm talking more specifically about, so this would be the implementation piece of it, right? So if you are talking about building that relationship to do what? So what are you trying to build that relationship to do? That ties into the training, because how is the detective going to be trained to show up? How is the advocate going to be trained to show up? Okay, so that's a piece that we could be looking at. Like, how do we make that happen? Then what is going to be sort of the outline for the policy? We've decided this is what's going to happen. The relationship is going to be built. Okay, so now break that down. How will that happen? What can we propose the detective would need as a baseline to show up? So let's say we want this, this, and this for him to sort of show up as a detective. And then the chief can sort of then give us, like, as a current policy right now, our department hosts 3 different racial bias trainings or implicit bias trainings. And this is what they look like. And you could say, okay, that's great. The detective is going to take that training, and we'd love to propose that for that training, you have this amount of credential to do that training. This is who's going to be monitoring, evaluating that. Chief, have you thought about who's going to oversee people actually doing this well? All of those pieces. Do you see how it's like a domino effect of like pulling the different pieces together to sort of map out the implementation of that particular policy?
So, there are 2 pieces. One is, just that Hope and the police department detectives, get together and outline a set of meetings just to build relationship. So part of it is, if this group thinks that that's something, then they would probably bring forward that outline. I guess what I'm
But I
wondering
guess
is,
what is the outline? Like, what is the out? I think that's the question
Right.
I have, and maybe that's not what you all have. What is the outline? Because
they would
saying
decide
building,
that. Yeah.
yeah, but like, to what end? Like, so you right? So like, I think that's my question. Maybe I don't want to speak to your group, but like, to what end does that? What does that do? Because if you put that forward as a recommendation, like, to what? To do what? What is that sort of? Is that making the system more equitable? And if so, in what way? Or like,
I think
what are we
Sarah
doing?
has that. Sarah, that was kind of a thought that you had. Do you want to speak to that? Do you remember when you were saying it'd be good to get to know the detectives as people?
Yeah, I think that it boils down to trust. Do our advocates trust law enforcement that they are going to treat survivors in an equitable manner? And the same thing, do the officers believe that if an advocate shows up, that we're not going to be in the way, that we're there to help and not to hinder an investigation? And so it's just that trust piece of, do we know that each party has the victim at the center of our goals? And knowing the person on a personal level helps go with that to eliminate some of those second guessing questions of each other.
So what does that look like in practice? So let's say I'm sort of calling in to report a sexual assault and a detective shows up with an advocate. I think what does that look like for you all? You know, in terms of, if the trust, how do you build that trust so that when these two come, they're victim centered?
So how that looks like is, if you call an advocate first, I know that Roger is someone who's going to put the victim first and is going to follow their lead. And so when I talk to you, I'm going to say, hey, I know this detective down at the police department, Roger, I know you're not a detective, but Roger, and he is going to follow your lead. He's going to start by believing you. He's going to let you be in charge of where this path goes. You can stop at any point in time. You can trust him. And vice versa. If you show up at the police department, Roger can say, hey, I know Sarah down at Hope. She's an advocate. She is just here to be by your side. She is your person to answer any questions that you have, and is there to trust and believe in you and to let you know where the resources are. So that we know from both directions that we can trust each other, and that if we bring the other party into the deal, that we are all there for the same goal, and that is to support the victim through their healing process.
Okay, then I hear you and I agree. Then that needs to be more explicitly stated in the recommendation. Because when I see the sentence, I'm like, okay, cool, that's great. When you have a vague sentence like that, that's how policy gets sort of in a space where it's inequitable for people, because it allows people to then make the assumptions about how they're going to respond and react in that moment. But if there's a clear process of, at 4:10, this person does this and this person does this, and before they even get to do this, they have to have this training, and it has to be this way and mandated that way, then this allows the trust to build for me to show up to be able to do this job. So that I think that's where I'm getting at. It's like, what would be the bare minimum to flesh out a recommendation like that? Because I think that leaves too much to the imagination for people. And I heard and I remember hearing last time that we're not being victim centered. Still means that we need to be a little bit more thoughtful and equitable in how we write that policy. So yeah, Sarah, chime in. I don't want to
So I don't want to derail the conversation from where we're going, but that is why I held up unsure on the changes in the policy piece, because it says, I don't remember the exact language, but it's something along the lines of, will try their hardest or will do their best to call in an advocate. And to me, that leaves too much of a barrier of, and I'm not saying that Roger's team would do this, but I am saying that there are police officers who have done this, of saying, oh, this is the third time Jane Doe's called in this week. It's just because she's using her body to get meth, or because of whatever reason, we're not going to call in an advocate because it's not real, or we don't believe her, or we don't believe him. And so I think that leaves a loophole that creates inequities. If someone who is most vulnerable, which we know BIPOC folks are the most vulnerable for sexual assault, people who have addictions are most vulnerable, and people have mental illness. So they're the most vulnerable to sexual assault and the most likely not to be believed.
Okay, so what do we do about it? Michelle, do you want to pull up that actual recommendation and we rewrite it?
Yeah, we can. And really what it sounds like from Sarah's thoughts is that it went one step better, but not enough. And maybe Corey and Roger can weigh in here. It used to say that officers are encouraged to connect a victim with an advocate. Now it says officers will prioritize and make every effort to connect the victim with the advocate. And then it talks about how they would do that. And then whenever possible, the officer would wait for the advocate to arrive until any further questioning of the victim, which is a change too. It sounds like Sarah would like to say, you know, the officer will in every case, but I don't know if there has to be some wiggle room. So Roger or Corey, maybe you can weigh in on that.
I think we need to break it down piece by piece, right? Because this will allow everybody to get a chance to weigh in. Like, I don't want to like drag us back and be very slow about it. But if this is something that we want to push forward, and I think Juan is raising his hand, like, I want to be thoughtful about line by line. Oh, you're not. Okay. So can we just get like the first line and then everybody sort of weigh in on that? Like the first piece where it was like, it went from encourage to something else. And then Chief and Corey, I want you to weigh in on it too, because can we stretch the language more, or does it have to stay like this? I don't think it has to stay like this.
No, and just before we get into that, I think what we would say is we would bring back to you in December. We would go and do some more work and bring back some of these more final recommendations in December. So if you all say things like Sarah saying it's not strong enough, instead of maybe wordsmithing the whole thing, because you know how that works in a committee of 11, is we could pull out, what do you think is not strong enough? What are some thoughts from the police, so that we can then go back and do some of that homework to present you with what you might want to see, or at least bring back 2 or 3 options. And Sam, we will get to your falsely accused so we haven't forgotten that. But so I guess that's how I would approach it, is maybe getting the feedback from you all and then bringing something back.
But it still has to go by, not line by line per se, but still all the things that were in red on the original sheet are what we want to get sort of consensus on, so that we can then bring you the different options to sort of replace those pieces. And we would send that to you all ahead of the December meeting, so that you could then say, yes, no, I don't like this, I do like this, and we can like finalize that piece of it. Same thing for when Samantha wanted to sort of think about the falsely accused piece. Like, we want to be clear on like what pieces can we then give you all enough information to then be able to decide, like, this represents what we're trying to say. And like, we don't want you to have to do all of the work, but I know that many people are saying they wanted to do some homework ahead of time. So I'm sort of against homework, but I know that it's helpful for people to stay in the loop of things. So should we go through sort of encourage with sort of a question mark there?
Do we want to know for sure if we can say, Sarah, what would you put? And then maybe we can hear if that's possible.
I honestly don't know what I would say, because I know that Roger's concern is safety for his officers, which yes, like, that is important. I know that DV and SA are very volatile situations for officers to walk into. So I don't want to put your safety at risk, but I also don't want there to be a loophole for an officer to say, oh, I forgot to call. No big deal. I'll write it out.
What's the concern for safety, Chief?
Super snotty.
Well, maybe the officers can say too. Is there an option, Roger, that you think, or Corey? Where's Corey? Yeah. That would work, I guess.
Yeah, I guess
Chief, that's you.
Chief wants to.
Or Corey.
Go. I guess for me, my question is, Sarah, did you say you wanted to put as will contact an advocate? I just wanted to confirm that. So I guess the question would be, what if they don't want to talk to an advocate?
So a conversation that we had at a previous meeting was allowing us to come in and offer those services ourselves. And then if they say we don't want to talk to you, then we would leave. But being able to come from us, because a lot of times people will say, I don't want to burden another person into this situation. So I think it was either Keegan or Roger that said the example of, hey, I'll call my friend Sarah. You can talk to her for a second. And then we would ask, like, hi, my name's Sarah. I'm an advocate from Hope. These are the services that I can provide. Do you want my services? We would always ask that question. And if they said no, we would give them our number and our contact information and exit stage left. We're not going to force. We just want to offer.
So I'm seeing people shake their heads in agreement. Yes?
Juan's giving the thumbs up. Yeah.
And I'd just like to say too that, this is one of the things like we talked about, Sarah, too, and Minnesota, chapter 13 for data practices. This is something that the attorneys would have to look at and make sure that we're in compliance with the law. Because for me to invite an advocate into the room and physically look at the person or offer their services, now I've acknowledged that that person's a victim of a sexual assault. And sexual assault privacy is a top concern in the Minnesota statutes. So those are things that the victim almost has to agree to be willing to talk to an advocate. And if they don't say yes, those are concerns that we got to take into consideration.
Okay. Liz?
So when I read through this policy, I thought by adding what was in red made it much more personal and intentional. I liked what I saw. And I see both points, but I really see what Chief Pullman is saying, because honestly, Red Wing's a really small community. And let's say I'm a victim of, I'm just throwing this out there, I'm totally making it up. My husband and I get into a fight and this happens to me. I don't know as a person if I would want Hope Coalition to know what happened to me. I would appreciate being offered by the officer the opportunity, but I think I would want the opportunity right away to say no, because maybe I want to go somewhere else, or to get that counseling, to get that advocacy, and not know that I'm going to maybe show up at a meeting with the advocate under a different scenario later, just because we are such a small community. So I can really see where I think defining in the training what prioritize and make every effort really means is critical in this policy. That, it's kind of like beyond a shadow of a doubt when you define what that is. And in those definitions, then that can come through in the training of what that means. And if it's, if it can be documented that was been offered. But I do think it needs to be the person's choice, whether somebody shows up and puts eyeballs on them.
Okay, so thank you, Liz. Steve, I saw your hand. Give me 1 second. So Chief, can we get training information around this piece that Liz was talking about? Like specifically around the red line in that change. Can we get some training information from you all about how your department currently trains for that piece?
You want to answer as a department trainer, or?
Yeah, so basically what was sent in that guideline is pretty much what we train, or at least what we try to follow. I guess, Sarah, as far as some of the things you mentioned about this, I think you and Detective Quinn, with our detective setting up that meeting, I think would help greatly right off the bat of establishing that relationship. So when complaints such as that come in, we know about it and we can kind of target this and continue to work with our officers to fix it. That's kind of the dangers of jumping on some of these policies when we're talking about changing some of this wording. There's some of that unknown out there. If we can change it, if we can't, that might take some time and try to figure out the best wording. But I think the relationship, starting that right off the bat, would help greatly.
And if I could add real quick on top of that, Dominique, because I completely agree. Building our relationships with our partners over at Hope, I think, is just a win-win for the community. My two main primary detectives that handle sexual assault cases have been in investigations for over 10 years. And I know that some advocates have come and gone, and I don't know if the longest one over at Hope is right now, Sarah. I'm not sure. But, as they come in and move on, I think building that relationship or having something there that we build, like you said, that knowledge of each other so that we can properly convey our recommendations to the victims and still meet the requirements of the privacies, I think is critical. Thanks.
Gotcha. All right. So I saw Steve and Juan and somebody else, but I don't remember who that was. Oh, and then Sarah. Okay.
Okay, when we're talking about that first sentence, if you go down to the middle of it, all that red, that more or less supersedes that first sentence. You're already saying down there that the officer will use his or her own phone to call the advocate. So that first sentence can almost be taken out. If we're saying that they have to call, that covers it right there. Or am I misreading that? It says right there that he will use his phone to call an advocate. So there it's saying they will call him. It is not an option. Is that the way I'm reading it, right?
That would be, and I have a question later just about if that could meet the privacy. So if in Liz's situation, she may not want someone to put eyeballs on her, like she said, but could that, I don't know what the police officers would feel. I think that's why that was in there. Sarah, you can speak more to that, but.
Yeah, and just making the phone call to the advocate, that's not saying who the person is, showing a picture or anything. It's just the officer would call the advocate, say, hey, we've got a sexual assault case here, and I'm gonna tell the victim here that I have an advocate on the phone and see if they want to talk to you. And then they can turn to the victim saying, hey, I have an advocate from Hope that we deal with, blah, 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 have your spiel already, and say, would you like to talk to them? And they can explain to you how they can help you and the services they can provide and so on and so forth. So if we stick with that we don't even have to worry about that first sentence in there, the way I read it.
Gotcha. Juan, do you want to chime in? And then I think Sarah.
I agree with what Steve said. I mean, the scenario that Roger said, he said, if I come in there with someone from Hope, already walking into the situation, that might be against the law, the way the law is written. But I mean, you can offer that, but you don't have to bring that person in. Just, offer that service by calling them or having them somewhere there, but not in the area. And if they want to talk, then bring them in. If they don't, then no, but they should at least need to offer that, and also if, are we able to get someone in this group that has legal expertise? I mean, it's kind of like, the blind leading the blind here, where just for us to know if we have a question about the way the law is written, that could just answer that and say, what, that would work or that wouldn't work, And
That's a great idea. And what we can do at the city is look into that one and see who could be here, who has that expertise, and just have that person here each time. So I'll make sure that I look into that this week. That's a great idea. Thank you.
I have a question for you, Chief or Officer Corey. So when you all are sort of vetting these with the legal team, like how long does that actually take? Like, is it particular to certain policies that it's a lot of back and forth? Like, what's the average time? So let's say we do get someone here that does speak with us around the legal ramifications. Like, what does that process look like in Red Wing?
Right now, when I write a policy, I try to research it the best I can with the layman knowledge of it, so to say, and then I send it to our city attorney or the county attorney for review, depending on if it's an administrative process or dealing with criminal law, because our county attorney is our prosecutor. So that's what I was thinking in this situation. The best person is the county attorney that's on our SMART team is Aaron Keister. It handles most of the sexual assaults and domestic violence prosecutions in the county. And she would know right off the bat, the requirements on that.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Liz?
What if the sexual assault advocates came up with like kind of a personal note that the police could give to people that's little more than like a business card, but just like, hi, my name is Sarah, whoever it is, like to help you go through this, whatever it is. And that way, if they don't want a person called right away, the officer could give that to them, just kind of like a positive affirmation card little thing that they could give them, that they might think about it in a day or two and want to reach out. But it's a more personal, who they are, what they do. I understand what you're going through type of thing. You might be feeling this now, but tomorrow you could be feeling this. Please know you can reach out to me if they don't want to reach out right away. And that way you're not, you're protecting their privacy from the beginning, but offering them a more personal approach to connect with hope later.
Sarah, you want to weigh in on that? Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, I have, I'll address what Liz said and then something that Roger said as well. So we have coalitions, estate level coalitions that are working with the post board to be creating these policies and procedures. And we have access to 2 lawyers that are involved in this. So as soon as this meeting is over, I'm going to email those 2 lawyers and just let them know like what the questions are, so I can get that information back to this group and back to Roger. Because I know the intention is to have advocates there at every step of the way. And that's why our coalitions are involved at the post board level. And then in terms of having advocates there, one of the reasons why it's so important that we're there from the very beginning is because our roles are so much different than law enforcement. So law enforcement's job or role in a sexual assault investigation is to investigate a crime. Investigate the crime, find out who the bad guy is, if they have enough evidence to send it up the chart to prosecutor. An advocate's job is to help a victim become whole again and to walk them through the process and make sure their rights are being taken care of every step of the way. So do they need medical care? Do they need help navigating things with their employer now that they might have to miss work? Do they want someone to sit in while a police officer is talking to them and questioning them and letting them know what their rights are and what they have to and don't have to answer? So it's just a different piece of the pie. It's like if you go to the doctor, the nurse has a job and the doctor has a job. And if you take one of them out, you're not getting a full job. The full thing isn't happening. And so we're 2 pieces of a pie that are both important. So I just don't want to take away anyone's job and to realize that we both have different things to do.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing. So I want to get a sense of, because I'm looking at this with the red lines, and I feel like I think it's bolstered a bit, but my concern, and I think this is sort of, it ties into Sam's piece, is I, as a Black person, don't see myself in this policy. Like in terms of, not that we want a specific call out of when you do this, Black people should be this way, or sort of marginalized people. But what I'm missing, I think the pieces that were highlighted, I'm hearing a lot about in the big red, where the officer used his own phone, or the sort of greeting card or advocate card being sent. Those are 2 pieces that were floated up that I think could be good to explore. I think there's a lack of equity in this, in terms of what I keep hearing from you all is that if this is going to be a policy that everybody does and it's all this, we want it to be universal, what does that mean when you're doing this? Like, this seems very, it's missing that lens to me. And so I just had some questions on that. Like, what are you seeing in there? And Samantha, yes, your hand was raised.
I just maybe wanted to talk more about kind of what you just said. I'm glad you mentioned it. I'm kind of waiting. But I had a question too for Sarah. By we come to an agreement policy. Are you, Sarah, or anybody else think it's a little, or worried about me? Are we worried, or is it a thought that maybe if you are connecting yourself in with the policy, that you might be scaring some people away from hope because they don't trust the. And if you are showing you guys are like connected or have is that you do have a better relationship with. Is that coming off the right way in my wording? Because I can tell you, I know people that refuse to call the police department with an issue.
So
Frozen.
this is a
No, you're good. You're good. You're good, sir.
okay, sorry. So in the scenario for this policy, these are survivors that have already called law enforcement and bringing us in. And this is a little bit one-sided, but if somebody comes to us first, we're not going to force them to go to law enforcement because that's not our job. And I wish I had the statistics right in front of me, but it's something like 33% of people who are assaulted do call law enforcement. And we're going to tell someone what their options are, which is what that You Have Options program is, of how much to report, how much not to report, based on what they want to do and what they feel the most comfortable with. So we would not tell someone what to do. And as advocates, we don't make recommendations either. We tell people what their options are, what their rights are, and what possible consequences of those things can be, and then let them decide what they want to do.
Okay, I think what maybe I worded it wrong, unless my phone froze for a minute, but I'm saying like if I were to if I had to report a sexual assault and you know from the get-go I would be more comfortable calling you and not the police department. But if I knew you were wrapped up and having outside stuff going on with the police department trying to gather a relationship, I don't think that me personally, I mean, just making up a story here, like a timeline, I would probably not call either or at that point if I felt that I couldn't trust the police department, but you were working alongside them. So I'm just wondering, is this going to be affect people who do know you are working alongside the police department but don't trust them? I understand that it's going to be helpful, but is it going to affect people who, you know, not trustworthy because they don't believe in the police department's, you know, process? And also, if go through with however we change the wording for kit being there or offered no matter what, is there a is the funding or the budgeting for this training, if we have high hopes that the advocate will hopefully be accepted by the person reporting the assaults because it's offered, it is offered off the get-go? Makes sense.
I'm wondering if that FEDI training, someone else will know here, is the FEDI training not just for sexual assault, but for anyone who's undergoing trauma? So it's how you interview someone, whether it's a hate crime or it's sexual assault or domestic violence. Is that true for those of you who know that? So that would be my only thing there is, my understanding is FEDI is for officers, detectives, anyone who's trying to get better at interviewing. Is that correct? I don't know if that answers the question, but it covers more than just sexual assault, I guess.
Okay.
So I just respond to something Samantha said. I've gone into situations where someone is being interviewed by a victim's being interviewed by law enforcement, and they say things like, Sarah and I are partners. And I will stop and say, actually, we're not. Like, Samantha and I are on a team and I'm here to support her. And yes, Roger and I work together sometimes, but my job and my role is to support you, Samantha, and I'm on your team. And so really from the get-go, letting folks know that you were there to support the survivor and you were their person, that you were there every step of the way with what they want and the goals that they have in mind and the support that they need. And just law enforcement is one piece of a very large puzzle that people who have been assaulted have to navigate.
Okay, so I know Michelle is gonna jump in because we want to move forward on some things, but one of the things that I think is going to be a potential sort of not roadblock, but if this is sort of a working policy, there are things that are tied to it. I know we talked about the data component, the training component, and those pieces. They're all tied to this policy, and so if we are going to like sort of really reconcile this policy, it's going to have to tie into how people are trained and what is or isn't collected. And then it's also going to tie into the budget. So those overarching buckets are really important. And this would then be, the final recommendation for this sexual assault policy, tying in the fact that the training piece, everybody's mentioning FEDI, the data piece, like how transparent can we be in this process to ensure not only equity but dignity for victims and survivors, and then the budget piece of it's a lot of money to sort of really pull holistic care on top of collaborative efforts for the department on top of sort of a COVID budget. So those are things that we have to think about as well. So I guess what I'm trying to get a sense from you all is how would you like to sort of approach putting this as a policy forward? Like what would be the logistical sort of ask? I know Juan wanted a legal person to sort of be here to do that, which I think is great because as we're sort of troubleshooting and thinking about this, we need that perspective. But if we're looking at like what type of, if this policy were to be enacted, let's say the red is acceptable enough to move forward, what does that look like in terms of how we're going to collect the data? Because if the partnership is going to be between Hope Coalition and the department, who's collecting what? Because the numbers were very different. What are we collecting and how do we do that? And then the piece around the training, because everybody talks about officers having that emotional, social capacity to be able to do this work. What does that look like? So are we going to sort of move through which level of pieces would we want to move through first in terms of like shoring up this as a policy? Do we want to have someone come and talk about like the data portion of that with us? Like Michelle, jump in because I'm trying to get temperature check.
Well, I'm wondering if what I've been thinking is that by diving into this one call for service, this one specific thing, to me, it's kind of shown, and I don't know about all of you, but that there are these foundational pieces of how the department is built that we all don't really know how it is built. And so it would be interesting for you all to look at and think about those 4 buckets, how we write policy, how we train, how we do data, and how we do budgeting. And to say, what would you like to dig into? I don't know if this is too big, but to say, how do we do that? And look, you've got some specific sexual assault recommendations here, but there are also some that need to be brought forward in more detail. But it might be worth digging into some of those. How are we building our foundations? And then what did you have to say? Sam, did you have a thought?
I kind of lost my train of thought there, but I do think that data would be important to Hope, and not just in this policy, but across the board because of something I learned yesterday that I was not aware of as far as race-related data not being collected.
So if you're saying, and we could just do something where people go again, like thumbs up or to the side, is data something that this group wants to dig into? How do we collect it? What do we collect? Why do we collect it? So I see Doug is saying yes, Sarah's saying yes, Corey is saying yes. Oh, Cholo's thumbs up. Liz is yes. Sam, we're talking about data. You're interested in, give me a thumbs up or, okay, yes. And Thomas is saying yes. So I'm getting, oh, and Juan, are you?
But
Yeah.
we then need to have someone who can speak to, like, Chief. I know the Chief is here, but one of the things too is if we're going to have that legal person, because if the Chief says we don't collect this or we need to figure out how to collect this, then who is the other person or the counterpart that makes the decisions about how the data is collected? And I'm not trying to negate you at all, Chief. I'm just trying to say, like, who would be your counterpart so that when we come back at the next meeting, we can sort of just move forward and make sure, like, okay, these are the pieces, this is how it goes. And then somebody can be like, yes, that works for Red Wing, or no, it doesn't. And this is why.
Mm-hmm.
Like your counterpart or whomever that would be in the city.
Yeah, and that's probably more than one meeting, I would say, just because how we collect data is a big deal. But we do collect it in a lot of ways. And I know you know that, Don, and I'm kind of reminding myself because I try to want to get everything done right away. But, you know, how we do that in education, how we do that in law enforcement, how we do that in the city, how we, you know, there are lots of different ways. So if this group is interested in this, what I don't want to have happen is that you think that we haven't done anything around sexual assault. What I think you all have decided are a couple really good things. You've decided that you want Hope and the detectives to start building a relationship and come back with some, you know, maybe just a mini thing about why they're doing that and what they're doing. You've decided that you want to at least have someone look into FEDI training and see if that's possible. And then there were some that were big yeses. Oh, the bilingual officer. So there are some things that we can send you tomorrow. These are the things that you said yes to. But it's sort of looking at, if you want to start digging into data, maybe that's a way to go. I don't know. It seems like that is of interest to everybody. And we want to make sure that the group, if you all have an interest in it, then that tells me that's something that we should probably dig into.
Doug has a question. Yeah.
Yeah, a question or comment. I mean, it seems to me if we're going to be making recommendations on these other policies, other areas, like if you don't have data on that, you're just shooting in the dark, right? If we're going to start somewhere with these 4 buckets you've outlined, and I think are reasonable and good 4 objectives, I really think data's got to be the first one, or you've got no information to go on. You're going on feelings, and like you really can't trust your feelings to make decisions on policy that affects everybody, right? Because my feelings are different than everybody else's here. I have a different lived experience than everybody else, so we really need to start with that concrete data thing, so we have a place to jump off from and get into some conversations.
Okay.
Do we need to have, so for the homework, I'm thinking, Michelle, for next time, what specific pieces of pre-work would you all like when it comes to data? So like, are we just giving, so is this Chief and Officer Corey, are you guys giving a list of like, these are all the things we collect and this is how we collect it? Or, you know, what are the parameters for what we're, because data's a lot. And I just want to make sure like that we're getting you the right sort of pieces to give you foundational conversations and sort of I don't want you going down a rat. It's so much data.
We collect, yeah.
No, and that's a good point, because you know our records management system is huge, because it starts with the initial call or 911 call, the initial call from the citizen, whether it's handled over the phone or whether it's handled in person by an officer. And then from there, it goes on to measure, you know, actual arrest outcomes, who was convicted of which charges. So like I think in last year, our numbers, we had about 3,000 some hundred arrests and convictions. So that is the actual outcome of those number of crimes. Whereas our calls for service are just that. They're part of the 14,000 to 15,000 calls for service that we handle per year, which yeah, and we have an individual in dispatch that works with the records management system company that can rewrite reporting programs. So it's basically coming down to what kind of data are we trying to collect that we need to pull out of the RMS system, and is there a formula that he can adjust to pull the data that we need instead of what we're currently getting, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Juan, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, here's some data on this slide presentation we have. It says on the training, each officer is required to get 48 hours of continuing education every 3 years. I mean, do we think that's enough? Like, I mean, I work for 3M and I feel like I do 48 hours of training in 1 year, you know, and then on the bottom, it says here, mandatory trainings being added January 2021. It's 6 hours of crisis intervention and mental illness crisis and 4 hours of autism training. So meaning that's not required as of this moment. And even though it's going to be mandatory January 2021 is 6 hours of training for mental illness. Is that enough? 4 hours of autism training. We have a mandatory training here. It says 6 hours of training in crisis response, conflict management, and cultural diversity. That says 6 hours. That's mandatory. Everything else that's mandatory, like use of lethal device taser, firearm policy, firearms training. None of that says how many hours are required. Is that because there's a lot more hours? Because I feel like 6 hours of training for culture diversity, I mean, that's nothing. 6 hours of crisis intervention for mental illness. Like we all know how much, I mean, how big, I mean, that's important. 4 hours of autism training. I mean, we have that one incident not too long ago that we had in Minnetonka, you know, that the mom called the police because her son was having a mental breakdown. Here the police shows up and he kills her son. You know, like, because the cop felt like he was in danger because he had a knife in his hand. Like,
so you wanna, so is this the data, and I'm asking because Michelle takes notes so that we can then disseminate the right stuff. So when you're talking about data, you're asking about, you want training information data.
Well, I mean, I have the data right here. I'm reading it off the slide. What I'm wondering is that enough? Like, do all of us here collectively think that's enough?
And maybe what I could get one for the next time is to see what police departments are doing around the country and how that compares to others. But that still you still get to say, is that enough for Red Wing? You know, but then you'd have a little more context about what departments are doing around the country. And you all could say that is enough or that's not enough. And then you can say, this is the amount of money that's spent on that. Do you have some suggestions on rearranging that or something? So, and just
what we could do is
a time check is 10 minutes, Dominique. So I just want to let you know.
Gotcha. So for this, I think we could put on there, sending out, like you said, best practices for comparison for different counties and sizes, and then thinking about like what's on the books for some of those, because I think that's important in terms of data, like how much money each department in comparison spends on this. And Chief, I saw your hand raised, and then Officer Corey, I saw your hand too.
I just wanted to point out real quick that I think that must be a typo. The 6 hours should have been 16 every license period. By the 2018 legislature, we have to have 16 hours minimum in those mental health, crisis awareness, and cultural awareness training in those categories that Juan had mentioned. So that's 16 hours in a 3-year period minimum. And then what they're adding in 2021 is going to be added on top of those minimum training requirements that they added in 2018. I'll let Corey answer the use of force question as far as concerned to hours there. But the other thing I was going to say is, and these are minimum requirements, what our department averages, and Corey can correct me if I'm wrong, but we average about 110 hours every 3 years of training per officer when they get their license renewal. We never have anybody that's close to not getting renewed because they don't have enough hours. We are way over the state average per officers, because that's a focus of mine is training and education. Thanks.
So can you provide
Do you
that,
collect
Roger?
that? Yeah, do
Yeah.
you collect that?
So we have all that collected because we have to reapply every year for our state aid, which is where we get the dollar amounts for reimbursement on what we have spent on training. So
Does this tie into, so let's say you got an officer, and I'm not picking at it, I'm just sort of trying to get a little bit of clarity here before we wrap up. So if you say we did these trainings this year, do you have any records that cross sort of says, okay, well, we had 110 hours and we had this amount of sort of incidences related to this type of training? Because I think that's a concern for people too, is like, how effective is the training? Because if you are looking at, we have 110 hours for mental health crisis training, and then you're still sort of logging in your calls for service, 55, 60, 70 calls a day. That's not really, but you get what I'm saying? Like that is showing a level of it's not effective in some way. So do you have data that sort of does that? Like annually, we are charged with 110 hours and in mental health crisis, and annually, this is how many mental health crises we had, and this is how they went well, and this is the number that we couldn't de-escalate and they went bad.
that would be under our annual use of force reporting and or what we call our resistance response. So that was where we would identify if something went wrong and an officer had to go hands-on or use a level of force. But I see Corey's waiting to answer also.
Yeah, so the question kind of grew larger and larger, but to start from the beginning here, I sent out an email and I'll kind of go through it as well again. So far for 2020, every officer in the department has had 59.5 hours of training conducted. We also have another 652.5 hours of training that was dispersed through typically job specific or something an officer was requesting. We also have additional hours that are kind of added throughout that documenting. So like Chief was saying, we are well over the mandate. We try to shoot for as much training. Me being a trainer, I love training. I'm always for more. I would never turn it down, but I just wanted to kind of go through that list. As far as Chief was talking about the annual review, specifically when you're talking about resistance response, when an officer uses force, that incident is going to be reviewed by multiple people. And then that's documented and it's put into a spreadsheet. At the end of the year, we do review all of that with the entire department statistically to see what went well, what went bad, etc. And that is data that I also use to try to zoom in on what we need to focus on for training.
Gotcha. Well, can you help us? I think, because I know we have to wrap up. Normally, when we do community data dives, a lot of people look at the big like demographics, like race, population, gender, all like, and see which departments are collecting for which. Is it possible that we could get access to that before the next call so we can sort of go through those big buckets of what people are asking for? Like, are you collecting on race? Are you collecting on gender? Are you collecting on these things? And then also this piece around the training that Juan had brought up. Could we get sort of a package item of those things? And then you all help us like navigate what is and what isn't as we compare it to like the national sort of, or not even national, but other localities that are doing this? Because I think that could be a really good comparison piece to like, for us to explore if we're all trying to talk about data. Unless, chime in everybody, like what other types of data are you hoping to get? Because I want to, again, just say it's a lot of data that's collected from a department. And I don't want you all going down a rabbit hole of things that you don't want to know. I just want to get a sense of like what you want to know. And Michelle's going to kill me because I know we're up at time, but like, can we get a sort of, maybe we email Michelle some things that we want to know from the data so that then we can give that to you sort of in like a 101 guide, and then have the Chief and Officer Corey sort of go through those with us and help us to learn about the Red Wing data and like what it does show and what it doesn't show.
Sam, did you have something?
To that question specifically, Dominique, I'm mostly focused on the race related data, what's being collected and what's not. But I originally rose my hand when Officer Huberty was speaking about the use of force and how it gets reviewed. I'm curious on who reviews that and who decides what went wrong and if anything did and why.
So I wonder if there is a way, I'm brainstorming here, if there's a way that maybe people can, like Sam, you've got that specific question that I'm guessing we can provide an answer, that maybe we can do some of that, you know, by email so that people, I mean, we don't want a million things going back and forth, but I do want to be able to get some of you some specific answers to questions. So I'm wondering if we can do that. And I also would like to, when we decide what you want for the next meeting, I would like to get you all the information a week in advance. This time we did better. We did like 3 days in advance, but we'd like to get it to you a week in advance so that you can look at it and get us your questions so that we can have answers to those questions by the time we meet. Do you know what I mean? So you're not just all seeing it for the first time and then it goes on. So it would be nice if we can decide, and maybe that is a way for you all to send in your questions. Here's the kind of data you would like. Okay, Juan is saying yes. To send in the questions that you want. Send in the questions that you want answers to related to data. And I've written down what Juan has said, and Liz already wrote an email earlier today about training. And I apologize because when I asked the chief and Corey to provide information on mandatory and optional training, I worded my question wrong because I thought that information reflected what was mandatory and then any optional things we do, but that slide didn't provide that. So do you know what I mean? So Corey, I probably didn't ask that properly because you're saying you guys provide a lot more training than what that showed. So we'll make sure that we get that correct data and that correct information. But
and I can try to I think we have a couple of public reports coming out around sort of data, and what we track for are traffic stops, use of force, and pedestrian stops, and then how they overlay with the population demographics. And so what I can try to do is bring sort of a sample of that I'm trying to think of a city that's equivalent. So you can see, like, if these cities collected for race data, what does it look like in the context of Red Wing, so that we can map it over to see if there are any pieces that they've been doing well in these departments that have been helpful in reducing those disparities, because that's what we do. We sort of give five-year reports around, like, okay, you've reduced this because when we first worked with you, you had these disparities and this is what it looked like. And now this has sort of been reduced. And it's probably because of these factors. And a lot of them play into sort of population demographics, racial demographics, and all of that stuff. And then like recommendations for how to do it. So what I can do is try to get sort of just a comparison piece so you guys can have a sense of, like, when people talk about data a lot, they're talking about use of force, traffic stops, and pedestrian stops. So that those are the things that are most commonly tracked among departments and are also sort of tracked by the demographics that people really want to talk about, like race, gender, crime levels, and all of that stuff. So I'm happy to sort of figure out who, we have a couple public reports coming out in some cities, so I can see and get that to you all if you're interested.
And then Sam, I'm going to contact you offline so that we can talk more about the falsely accused, so that I understand more about what you want there. So is it just specific to sexual assault, or is it an overriding thing? So how about if you just have an answer quick, and then we can talk about it later.
Originally, it was just sexual assault because we were on that topic, but I would like the answer for both.
Overarching is what you're saying?
Over what?
Like the overarching idea of being wrongly accused?
Yeah.
For any crime?
Current standing policies are on, across the board for that.
Okay, thanks.
All right. I think we're at sort of time now. We're a little over time. So what we will do is sort of package up the data that's necessary for you all to like sort of start the primer and the deep dive. And then I do want to make sure that we are responsive to what Juan said, bringing in sort of a legal policy expert so that we are not going in the dark, as so to speak. And then if there are any specific data things that you would love sort of a general context on of like how is it supposed to go outside of like what is the national standard or what is sort of the best practices around the country, I can put those pieces together so that you get context for the larger pieces. So with that said, I think, we should wrap up, but I do want to be responsive to that. So if there are materials or things from different localities and stuff that you are interested in knowing more about as you're sort of diving into this data piece, flag it for me so that I can get you those materials and tools.
And then just know that we will not be radio silent until the next meeting. So I will have more time to dedicate to this in between meetings. So we will be kind of getting you things. And as Dominique has things that, if there are a couple things, we want to be able to give you a couple weeks to read through things, and so please email things and then we will also email back.
Mm-hmm. And then what the email said earlier today, revisit your email from earlier today with some of those, that first paragraph and those questions and stuff. So I think that we'll wrap up here, and you all have a good night. And again, send all your questions and your thoughts as we sort of do the deep dive into this.
Okay. All right.
Good night.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Michelle or Dominique?
Oh, yes. Hey.
Hi. I mean, I had my hand up for like 15 minutes. And
sorry. Okay, here we go. Whoops, cancel. Okay.
For me, what's really important, and you guys touched on it, but that's why I was like for 15 minutes doing this. I really need comparable communities in Minnesota for this data, because it doesn't do me any good to have a community in Pennsylvania or Illinois or Nevada. I need Red Wing and a comparable. I mean, we're talking apples to apples, but like Macintosh to Honeycrisp, like, are we talking, like Wasika? We need to find communities our size and our makeup and look at like the police budget and all of those kind of things and how much they put into training. And because I don't want us to try and compare ourselves to somebody it's not going to do us any good. We don't know anything about those communities. We know about southern Minnesota communities. And I really hope that that's what we can start comparing ourselves to in order to move forward with, because it does me no good to look at data if I don't have comparables that I recognize to say, okay, this makes sense, or wow, we're really over in that, or we seem under in this.
Okay.
Hoping that when we compare this stuff, it's pertinent to us. It's a Red Wing, and we all know what communities we're talking about.
Okay. Nope, that's really good, Liz. Nope, that's good. I've got that down. So thank you. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Bye.